So with this programming challenge, it gets a little more complex, which is why I'm going to try breaking it down. Now we are going to be using parallel arrays, which means instead of you just working with one specific array, we're going to be working with multiple arrays. On this particular assignment, you'll be working with two different arrays. Now this is the problem you're getting. It says write a program to read employee ID numbers from a file and count how many belong to each group. You are going to get a text file with numbers already in it. And the idea here is for you to read from that file and figure out if that specific number you're reading belongs to one of these four groups. Now, if the number belongs within, or if the number is within the range of 100 to 299, then that number belongs to group 1, which is HR. Now, if the number is between the range of 300 and 499, then that number belongs to group 2, which is purchasing. If the number belongs between the range of 500 and 789, then that belongs to group 3, which is IT. And if the number belongs between 800 and 899, then that number belongs to group number 4, which is executive. Now you are going to create one function, so a specific function, just to read the IDs from the file, the Employee.txt, which is the one I included on Blackboard. So if you go all the way to the bottom, there should be a Employee.txt in there that you're going to end up downloading and using. Now you will also create a separate function just to display the total numbers or the total counts per each group. So your first function, again, is to just read the text file and tally how many belong to each group. And then a separate function is going to be just for you to display the total counts per group. The idea here is for you to be able to send data between functions and display them correctly. Now, this is an example of what you should be outputting to the screen. On the right, you do have the text file that you're going to end up receiving that you can download already. These are all the numbers within. The idea is for you to export or display something like what you see here. So 10 employees belong to group 1, which is HR. 15 employees belong to group 2, which is purchasing. 5 employees belong to group 3, which is IT. And 10 employees belong to group 4, which is executive. What we're going to be using is two different arrays. One of them is going to be our groups, which is our HR department, our purchasing department, our IT, and executive departments. And the second array is going to be the one keeping our counts. It is important to make sure that both arrays are the same exact size. So for ours, we are using an array size of 4. And we are going to have it aligned. And we'll talk about that more once we're coding or programming. But we do need to have it aligned. That way, if I ever display the index 0, I know that I'm talking about my HR department. And I should be able to bring up the count for that HR department. So for example, if I do a cout statement to display group 0, then I should be able to get this data here. If I do a cout statement to display the count for 0, then I should be talking about HR, and I should grab the counts for that one. Now that being said, let's start programming. So we are going to use Repel. Just like always, go to the top right corner. We are going to choose C++, and the name of this one would be Programming Challenge Employee IDs. So we'll create that one. So I'm going to erase everything within our main function. We already have iOS stream up here. So I'm just going to include my F stream so I can read from a file. And using namespace standard, which we ended up deleting from the main function that they ended up having here. Now the next thing we need to define before we even get started is our prototypes. So we are going to define our function prototypes. The first one I'm including, again, if you go back to the project, you'll see which ones you need, but the first one I'm going to include is my prototype to read an ID from the text file, which is the one that we ended up including. Talking about that, let me just upload my text file. So there's several ways of you doing it here. You can click on the three-dot menu and upload a file. Look for your Employee.txt and open it. And you should be able to add it in here. Now, if for some reason you can't upload your file, just go and create a brand new text file. And you can call it Employee.txt. I spelled it. And I already have mine, so I'm going to name this 2, just so I can give you the example. And you can type everything in here or copy paste it from your assignment. I'm not going to use that because I already uploaded mine, so I'm going to delete this one. But my numbers, so there should be a total of 20 numbers. My numbers that I'm going to be reading are already within this text file. So again, I am including IOStream, fstream to read from that file. And my first prototype that I'm including here would be a read ID, because we are going to be reading this file. And now within this function, we're also going to not only read each individual line, but check which group these belong to. The other function that's required within this project is to display the counts. So I'm going to do another void display counts, which is again just to display the data that we ended up collecting and organizing within our read ID function. Now within our main function, the first thing we need to initialize would be our 2 arrays. So we have a group array that we're going to end up using and a count array that we're going to end up using, similar to what we talked about earlier. So in case we forgot, these are the arrays we're trying to create, which is our string group and our int count. So our group array is going to include our groups or departments, and our int count is going to include our counts for each individual department. So the first one we're going to set up here is our string groups, and we are going to make this a string just because we're using the names of the departments. So we are going to use HR, purchasing, IT, and executive, and we are going to initialize this variable with these names already. So our string groups array is going to be equal to HR as the first array. Oops, there you go. HR is the first array index, and our second index we're going to have purchasing. Third one's going to be IT, and the fourth one is going to be executive. Again, all of these are within quotations because it is a string array. And our second array we're going to end up including here is our counts array. Now, since we are using this one to keep track and count how many numbers we find within each individual group, this is going to be an int array. Again, similar to what we mentioned earlier where we had int counts and each individual array was going to be initialized to 0. That's the same exact thing we're doing here. So we are going to initialize int counts to all zeros. Now this is not going to be in quotations because this is an int variable and not a string variable. Now that being said, let's finish the main function so we can start with our other functions. So I'm going to put a return 0 just to make sure we don't forget to do that at the end. That being done, the first function we're going to end up creating would be a function to read the IDs from the employee text file and tally how many belong to each group. So remember, we already created the prototypes for these functions. So the first one I'm using is void read ID. So it is going to be a void function just because we are going to be doing the work within the function. We're not returning anything back. Alright, so we have our read ID function. So what do we need in this function? That way we can transfer our variables before we even get started. So we know we are going to need minimum the counts. That way we're adding to that individual index based on what group that number belongs to, or that ID belongs to. So we need to transfer counts. What I'm going to do is, as we're adding our tallies, I want to be able to display what group that belongs to so I can see it on the screen. Now this is not a requirement within our project or problem, but I just want to make sure I'm able to see where each one of those numbers is being sent to, and I want to be able to display to make sure everything's running correctly before I finish the project. So I'm going to transfer both the string groups array and the int count array. So that being said, I need to go back to my prototypes. Make sure I create them there as well. So I got my string groups and my int counts. I'm going to go back to my function, make sure I'm passing those two as well. Alright, so the first thing we are going to be doing in this read ID function is to import the file to read. So again, within this function we need to read the IDs, and we'll do this by doing an if stream, so in file stream, and then you can give it whatever name you want. We're just going to call it file. The other thing we need to do is open the file. So once we import the file, the ID knows that we have the file within, but we need to open that file. And we're going to do this by doing file.open. And then, of course, put the file name within. For ours, that would be Employee.txt. We also need a temporary file variable to read into our text file that we're going to end up reading from. So that one, I'm just going to create an int variable called temp. And again, we're doing an int variable, not a string, not anything else, because we are reading the numbers, as integers. So we're able to compare and check if they belong to a certain group. So basically, if they're between 100 and 299. And if we do a string variable as you're reading, you won't be able to compare those numbers as they're just strings and not numbers, or not integers. Now that being said, we don't, or technically we shouldn't know how long that text file is. So for example, if I gave you a different text file and it had a total of maybe 40 or a random number of employee IDs, then your program should be able to identify that and work according to the specific length. So since we technically don't know the length of that employee.txt file, we cannot use a for loop to read each individual line. We are going to use a while loop, and to read within the array, we are going to use a counter, which I'm going to identify. We are going to use a counter to identify the position within that array. So again, we're going to use another int variable. And on this one, it will be int I. And I is just going to be my counter. You can name it counter if you want to, or any other name. But I'm just going to use I. So I is going to be equal to 0, since we are starting at 0 index within our array. So to start reading within the file, again, we are going to use a while loop. And while the file says data within, we're going to keep on reading through. So the first thing we're going to do within our while loop is check if that first number we're reading is between any of these here. So if that first number is between 100 and 299, we want to make sure we add 1 to our count array within that section for that particular group. So if that first number is between 100 and 299, we're going to add 1 to index 0 in counts. If that first number is between 300 and 499, we're going to add one number to counts in index 1. If the number you read is between 500 and 799, we're going to add one to count index number 2. And if our number is between 800 and 899, we are going to add one to this executive index number 3. So how do we do that? So we are going to end up using an if statement just to check if that number falls within that range. So the first thing we want to check is if that number that we read is equal to or 100. And again, we are using equal to just because if we get a number of 100, which I think we do have one, which is 100, which is that first one, then we want to make sure we include it in that first group. So if the first number we read is 100 or greater, and if that number we read is less than 200, we are going to add 1 to that specific element within our counts array. So for example, if the number is, and we know that that first number is 100, if the number falls between 100 and 299, we want to add 1 to counts index 0. And that way we just know that we already have 1 within our HR department. So if this is correct, we're going to do counts index 0 plus plus. And that way we add 1 to that specific array. So if this is true, which we know that that first number is true, then counts in that specific array, which is in this one right here, should be equal to 1. Alright, so how about the other conditions? So we have our first condition. For the other ones, we need another if statement to check if that number we read is between 300 and 499. We also need another if statement to check if the number is between 500 and 789. And we need another if statement to check if the number is between 800 and 899. Just go ahead and do that. Space. So if the number is between 300, or if the number we're reading is over 300 and the number we're reading is under 499, we want to add 1 to counts in index number, and we'll go back to this one so you can see. So that's our second one. We're going to add 1 to index number 1. Why 1 and not 2? Because our purchasing department is index number 1. And again, in programming, we always start with 0. So 0 index is our first element in that array. Index 1 is our second element in that array. So we are going to add 1 to the second count. So this is going to be count element 1 or index 1 plus plus. And this should add 1 to that specific element in that array if that number falls within that range. Again, we'll do the third condition. And same exact concept. Counts 2 plus plus, which is our third element in that array. And our last condition is if we have a number that is more than 800 and less than 899, and same exact concept, we're gonna add 1 to that specific element in that array, which is counts 3 plus plus. So this should have all our conditions. So if the number we're reading is equal to or greater than 100 and less than 299, we are gonna add 1 to that first element in that array, which is for HR. If the number is greater than 300, but less than 499, we are going to add 1 to our second element in that array, which is for purchasing. And if our number is greater than 500 and less than 799, we're going to add 1 to the third element of that array, which is IT. And if the number is greater than 400 and less than or equal to, and we are including equal to because we are counting IDs up to 899, and that would be adding 1 more to that fourth element in that array, which is index number 3, which is for executives. Now if we run it, we don't get any errors, but we're not displaying anything to the screen yet. This is why I'm transferring both groups and counts, even though technically we only need counts. I'm transferring both groups and counts to be able to display what I'm reading and just to troubleshoot and see what's going on as my program is going. So even though nothing's wrong with the program, it is running. I want to be able to display, hey, is that first number that I'm reading between any of these conditions? And if it is, show me on the screen where that's being saved to. So again, this is not necessary. I'm just doing it to show you the way this is going to work out. So on mine, I'm going to do a cout. I'm going to grab that specific counter so you know exactly where we're at as you're going through the program. So if this is already a number 5, then you'll see number 5, so cout number 5, and then the number that we read in that line 5, and then belongs to group number 1 if this statement is true. So basically, if the 5th number or whatever number we're on belongs between this range, then I'll make sure I display to the screen this one belongs to group 1. Now again, this is not something that's necessary for this program because it is running. I just want to demonstrate as I'm going through it that everything's working correctly. And this helps a lot if you're having issues with your program and you don't know what is being sent to what or where you're adding numbers to. Then this is going to make it a lot more clear as you go through the screen. So again, my cout statement is the counter that I'm using. So basically, if this is the first time around the loop, then this is going to be 1. If this is the second time or third time, then that's the number it's going to be displaying. The temporary file or temporary variable is what we read from that file at that particular time. And if this statement is correct, then we should be within group 1, which is why I put belongs to group 1. And I'm just going to end the line after that. Now this can be anywhere within the if statement. I ended up putting it in between. Well, I'm going to do the same thing for the others, just to display to the screen and make sure everything's running correctly and smoothly. Same exact thing with the second group. The only thing I'm changing here is belongs to group number 2. And the first one I had belongs to group number 1. That's the only difference between what I did here and what I did up here. We're still going to display my counter, what we read from that file, and I'm just saying, hey, if this if statement is true, then I know this should belong to group number 2. Same thing for the third one. So my counter, what I read belongs to number 3, group number 3. And we'll do the same thing for the last one. This one should belong to group number 4. So if I run it now, well, nothing happened yet. Reason being is we still haven't called it from the main function. So if you go back to our main function, which is what runs from the beginning of the program, we never called that function. That's on me, so let's go back and fix it. Let me leave a little room there. And let's call our read ID function. Alright, so we are going to call our read ID function, and we need to make sure we pass both variables through. And this alone, if we run it again, should give us our group. Let me see. Something still went wrong with that counter. Oh, so we forgot to do the I++ at the very end. So our counter is called int I, but we left it at 0, and we never incremented that counter. So within our while loop, I'm going to do an I++, and run it one more time. There you go. So we started with our first element. We read 100, which if you go back to our text file, the first one is 100. And that belongs to group number 1. 101, which is the second one, belongs to group number 1. 102, same thing. 122, 132, 105, 280, which is still under 299, belongs to group number 1. 275, group number 1. Now 301 is already over 299, so that should belong to group number 2. So that should have been thrown to group number 2. 333 is still group number 2. 365, and so on and so on. So we should have read a total of 20 numbers. Now, for our code, we did do the counter is equal to 0, which is why we're starting at 0. If you wanted to make this a little more pleasant to read, you can start this one at 1. And that way you know this is read in line number 1. And the last one ended on line 20, so you have a total of 20 numbers. Now, although this is displaying which numbers belong to what group, we still need to satisfy the condition that they gave us, which is this is what they want to for us to export in the program itself. So you should have another function that displays the correct information similar to this here. So 10 employees belong to group number 1, which is HR. 15 employees belong to group number 2, which is purchasing, and so on and so on. So let's work on this section, which is the second function we're going to end up working on. So if you go back to the very top, we do have two functions. The second function is another void function, and this is to display the counts. So in order to do this, we're going to do the same thing we did with read IDs, which we're going to count. We're going to call the display count variable. I want to make sure we call our functions the same way. We're going to send both groups and counts as well. And now to create the function. So in here, we're going to type in void, because again, we're not returning anything. In our display count function, we're going to end up doing something similar to this, to where we're able to display both arrays within a for loop using that same index. So for example, we should be able to do a cout group index 0 and cout counts index 0 within the same for loop and display both the HR departments and that count for HR. I did notice that in here I forgot the closing parentheses. So it should be void display counts open parentheses string groups comma int group counts close parentheses and then open curly brace, and then I just left some room to be able to do our code. So in here, to display both arrays, we are going to use a for loop. So we know that the arrays are a length of 4. So as long as our indexes are under 4, so 0 through 3, then we should be able to display all array elements within. So to make it look similar to this, we are going to display the counts first. So for example, the first one says 10 employees belong to group number 2, or group number 1, I'm sorry, which is HR. So this first number should be our count for that particular index in that array. So we'll do a cout and then count I as the first iteration of this for loop is equal to 0. So now that we see that we have the counts for that specific element, or that specific element of the array, then we need to display employee belongs to group number 1, or employees belongs to group number 1. So that should be just a string that you're displaying to the screen. So we'll do that string right there. I left a little space here just to separate the counts from the string itself. And same thing at the end. So space, employees belong to group, and then a space. And then we're going to grab the variable I, which is what we're using as a counter up here. And I did a +1 just so we know that they belong to group number 1. Again, we are starting counting at 0, and that's the way the for loop works. And I just did a +1 so that in this iteration I'm showing a 1 and not a 0. So that should at least take care of the first part, which is 10 employees belongs to 10 employees belongs to group 1. Now we just need a dash and then the name of that department. Let's go back. We're going to do the dash as a string, same as before. So you have the dash with the space before and after, just to leave some space between. And then the last thing we're displaying here is the department name, which is our secondary. So we'll do this with groups, which is the name of the array. The variable I, which is a counter for the for loop. Oops. And we'll just end line afterwards. That way we display our counts, and depending on what count we had for that group, we'll display the count for that group. Employees belong to group 1 if it's a first iteration in group 2, and so on, depending on the iteration of that for loop. And then we have the group name coming from the group's array. Again, referencing back to this, we have the number of employees belongs to group, and then that group number, we're using the counter +1 so we can show 0 + 1, which would be number 1, and then we're displaying the department name at the end. Now if we run the code, oops, we got an error. Let me see. So my error again here, I did call the function, but within our prototype we're not defining our string and int count, or we're not defining our arrays. So let me just put those in real quick. And that should take care of our error. That squiggly line should go away within this section here. Let's run it one more time. And there you go. So the bottom section is doing the count exactly the same way that we said we would with the project itself. So if I go to the presentation, you have your number, or the count, and then employees belong to group, and then the number of group, and then the department. Same thing here. 9 employees belong to group number 1, which is HR. 4 employees belong to group number 2, which is purchasing, which I misspelled, so I need to change that. 3 employees belong to group number 3, which is IT. And 2 employees belong to group number 4, which is executive. So let's go back. So I'm going to fix that misspelling on my end. Let me see. So this section here, purchasing, I forgot the S. And if I run it again, There you go. Now to clean this up a bit, let's say you didn't want to display everything I ended up displaying, which is this section here. You can get rid of those, and you would have a much cleaner code. Reason I did this is just again to troubleshoot, just in case something doesn't go through. I'm able to see what went where. But this is exactly what they're asking for, and this is exactly what they're giving them. We're giving them the same examples, same as our example. We're showing the same exact thing. And that's it for this example, this programming challenge. If you have any questions, you know where to reach me.